Part 1. Into the Forest, Chapter 1. Blue Moon. Maisie. The Douve. The last of the twilight was rapidly fading. Soon I'd be operating almost blind. No human eye could adjust to the ominous all-enveloping black dark of the Douve Dorka, especially at night. I pulled my cloak tighter, but mere cloth couldn't warm away the fearful chill so strong that it reached for my soul. Never had I prayed so hard that a witch would be right about the weather, or hoped so emphatically that the promised blue moonlight would cut through the oppressing gloom of this foreboding forest, that it would reach its tangled floor. It was full autumn in the human realm, a season I loved, steeped with brilliant warm color and beauty, both melancholy and full of hope. If the state of the vegetation around me was any real indication of season, it was autumn here too, deep in the borderland between the home of the Fae and those of us who were merely mortal. The season didn't bode well for finding the rose the witch Morel had sworn I needed if she were to help me, had promised would bloom in the light of tonight's blue moon. Outside the forest, the frosts had already been worryingly heavy. Blooms were long gone, and bushes were heavy with red and orange rosehips. Trusting a witch in any matter went against my nature and plain common sense. Now it seemed that her knowledge of vegetation was suspect too. But what choice did I have? As I picked my way through the overgrown underbrush, a twig snapped beneath my foot. I jumped and nearly dropped the pink-handled dagger I carried, not so much for protection, but for pruning. I froze, heart pounding, watching the shadows that seemed to be watching me, listening for the sounds of being followed, in the gentle rustling of the trees, and the call of the night owl. Morel had warned me to leave any lanterns behind. Too much temptation. Not so much as a pinprick of light. The slightest sparkle will alert the Fae and the creatures who dwell in the forest to your presence. Then she'd armed me with directions to the glen where the rose supposedly grew, and a balm that was supposed to mask my human scent. Bring a sharp knife. The rose bush won't easily give up its flower. I need the rose and its stem intact. A long stem. Cut it as soon as it blooms, while the light of the full moon shines directly on it, and you can still see well enough to do the job. You'll have just minutes to act before the forest rejects the light and shrouds the rose in darkness. If you hesitate, or are an instant too late, you'll be at the forest's mercy. Lost forever. No one will be able to help you, not even me. Once you have the rose, it will guide you out of the forest and home. The Fae and forest monsters fear the power of its light. As long as the rose is in your possession, nothing in the forest can harm you. Reassuring. If Morel was telling the truth. I still didn't trust the shadows, but hearing nothing but the murmur of the forest, I pressed on. I had lived nearly my entire life just outside the boundaries of this strange forest, watching its seasons from the relative safety of the mortal world. But I had never dared venture in even one small step, let alone deep enough to guess at what kind of plants lay within. The fringes of the forest that we could see from our cottage window were dense with underbrush so thick no light penetrated more than a few feet in. Even the animals seemed to avoid the Douve. Rabbit and deer skirted it, afraid of the predators that lived in the deep dark. In bad winters, I'd seen deer so thin and starving that their ribs showed, and still they weren't tempted by the lush vegetation of the forest. Along with the Fae, the Douve was full of mythically fast and ravenous wolves and cougar, things that could make a quick meal of small prey and small girls. My dagger was surely meager protection against them. Our whole lives, as long as she lived, Mother had kept a close eye on both Katri and me to make sure we hadn't ever wandered too close to the Douve. Mother had believed that satisfying genuine curiosity kept children out of trouble. She was always one for the brutal truth. She answered our questions about the forest openly, even to the point of scaring us with myths and monsters. I could still hear her voice. The fear Dorka haunts the Douve, my beautiful girls. He's no one to mess with. He does the evil fairy queen's bidding, and her bidding is never good. The dark man is her right-hand man in the Unseelie court, a darkling so ominous and deadly it's been said he's death personified. He moves in the shadows so smoothly some say he is shadows. If he catches a human in the forest, he will snatch them away to the Unseelie court to be used for the queen's amusement. We all know what happened to Tamlane so many years ago. Disappeared, never to be seen again. And all the young men after him turned to monsters fated to roam the dew forever. Promise me, both of you, that you will never ever take so much as one tiny baby step into the dew. She had pinned us with a look overflowing with love and worry. I could hear my childish reply echo through the years. Not even if we're being chased by a bad man or a witch? Or a monster, Katri had added with wide eyes. Not even then. Mother looked grim. Better to die quickly at the hands of man than to be at the mercy of the Unseelie court. Looking back, it was hard to tell whether she spoke from experience or hearsay. It didn't matter. She was deadly serious. I was breaking my promise to her now, and it grieved me. I was a woman of my word, and took my oath seriously. But I had to fulfill another vow I'd made to her as I sat next to her on her deathbed, watching her slowly, painfully, waste away and die. Katri is weak and sick. Mother clutched my hand weakly and looked at me beseechingly with sunken eyes, her face pale. You must take care of her while she lives, which won't be much longer. At the rapid rate she's aging, I thought I would outlive her. Mother squeezed my hand. I hate to burden you, my strong girl. You have your whole life in front of you, and youth is fleeting, not something to ever be squandered. I want you to be able to live your life to the fullest, not spend it taking care of a girl who's an old woman before her time. Her voice broke. I knew how much she loved Katri too. We both wished things were different. But soon enough you'll be free. Promise? I'd never abandon Katri, Mother. You can count on me. Mother leaned back. Her voice was barely a whisper. If only there were a way to break the curse. I'll find it. I'll find a way. My impetuous nature had always gotten the better of me, made me overconfident. But one had to believe, or why even try? Oh, Maisie, my innocent. Mother reached up and stroked my cheek. Never promise something that's beyond your control. I set my jaw, determined not to let either of them down. Then I can only promise that I'll try. With all my body and soul. I promise I'll do my best. So here I was doing my best. Breaking one promise while trying to keep another. I picked my way through the maze of underbrush. The darkness had washed all traces of autumn color away, but fallen leaves and moist muck covered the forest floor. The musty, earthy scent of decaying plant life filled the air. Ancient oaks and ash rustled above me. I lived in fear of stepping on another twig and sending an explosion of sound through the forest again, pointing directly toward me a second time. I wished I was lighter of foot. There was no need to hand myself to the feared Dorca so easily, or alert my competition from the village to my location. The relative quiet meant that either I didn't have company, or someone had learned to move with more stealth than was humanly possible. I suppressed a shiver at the thought. Darklings moved like mist and shadow. I was on a hunt for healing for Katri. Everyone else in the village and surrounding province was on a hunt for beauty. Beauty was the coin of the realm in the kingdom, and our province was sadly lacking in it, according to worldly standards at least. We had our own touchstones, but those wouldn't please the king. And everyone knew it. Beauty brought with it great power and wealth. No more so than now when so much was at stake. For everyone, someone would be queen. It was unfortunate timing that Katri's illness had driven me to Morel for help. At the same time our handsome young king announced he was in need of a bride, and our province was next on his list to choose one from. Worse luck, that the rose appeared to be the solution for all of us. More competition and danger for me, as if there wasn't enough already. Although with the value of beauty so high, at any time I would have competition for something more valuable than gold. Beauty is always youth, Morel had said to me in her dark cottage full of the jars and unctions of her trade. And youthful beauty is always a sign of good health. A beauty potion will cure Katri. I can assure you of that. I couldn't argue with her logic. Common sense is common sense. When was the last time I'd heard an attractive older woman called beautiful without for her age added on? Beauty had to be youth. And the blush of youth was only beautiful when accompanied by fine health. Villagers had been going to Morel for beauty potions as long as I could remember. Why hadn't I thought of it before? It was as if Morel read my mind. Don't blame yourself for not coming to me earlier with this idea. I couldn't have helped you before. Without the rose, there isn't a potion strong enough. All the rest of my concoctions are only creams and lotions that aid or enhance beauty. They can't create it out of whole cloth. They can't reverse the aging process. I would have bet my life that Morel had promised too many others that a potion made from the rose would solve their problems, as she had me, and sent them after it as well. People with power and influence, and much heavier purses than mine. Rumors of it had even reached our home on the outskirts of civilization. As much as she tried to hide it, Morel had reeked of desperation. She wanted, needed, that rose. Even her long nose had broken out with sweat. I'd never seen her so agitated. The more people she sent out, the greater the chance that one of us would succeed in the nearly impossible task. Success was theoretically possible, but it certainly wasn't probable. I couldn't blame her. I would have used that logic if I were her too. But in the name of her own interests, she'd pitted us against each other, making competitors and enemies of neighbors and friends. The stakes were high, and the villagers had never been my friends. I was the strange girl from the strange family that lived on the edge of the Douve, a misfit among misfits. I was a girl without a beauty mark, a missing arm or a too short leg, too many fingers or toes, the complete lack of ears, or an extra limb, something to mark my family as having served honorably in the Great Magic War and been cursed for it. Something that made me unique, and more often than not resulted in a special talent. I wasn't ugly by any means, but I was certainly no beauty. In any case, not beautiful enough to catch a king's eye, and right now, that was all that mattered to everyone but me. How hard was I prepared to fight my own people for the rose? Weren't we all supposed to be on the same side? I couldn't allow myself to dwell on the thought of what I might or might not do or have to do, and the consequences of either choice. Even if I succeeded, I didn't trust Morel not to double-cross me. I worried that if I managed to bring her the rose, she wouldn't uphold her end of our bargain. I was growing warier by the moment. I should have seen someone else in pursuit of rose magic too by now. If I was on the right track, and the rose was nearby, shouldn't there be scores of others ready to fight for it? How sure was Morel of the location of the rose? Was she hedging her bets? Sending each of us to a place she only hoped it would be? Had she sent me to the least likely spot, while she sent a higher bidder to a glen she was more confident in? I had nothing to offer her, but my desperation to save my sister, and my willingness to brave the forest. Others had far more. I clenched the iron dagger tighter. Morel's warning kept echoing back. Find the rose, catch it as it blooms at the peak light of the blue moon, cut it and get out of the forest as fast as your feet can carry you. Don't worry about a light. The rose will guide you out. I was already doubting the directions she'd given me. I was far deeper into the forest than she'd led me to believe the rose would be. Either I was lost, or Morel had downplayed just how dangerously deep into the forest the rose was. But my memory was good. I was sure I was following her correctly, and I hadn't yet missed a single one of the markers she'd told me to look for. But what if I were running behind? I had to hurry. I wanted plenty of time to get in position. The forest floor was a tangle of grabbing fallen trees, branches, twigs, and limbs determined each in their own way to slow me down. Twigs snagged my stockings and skirts. Branches threatened my footing. Heaving roots made the ground uneven and tricky to cover quickly without tripping. If I fell and sprained an ankle, no one would come looking for me. Everything here loved the darkness and decorated itself according to those tastes. Moss, lichen, fungi, and mushrooms covered thick tree trunks like finery. Mushrooms grew thickly on the ground, nurtured by decaying leaves. The darkness as it fell seemed almost alive. My mother's words of warning rang in my ears. Darklings are as stealth as darkness itself, moving without sound. The dew had already fallen. I could see my breath. At home, breath floated and coiled until it evaporated into thin strands into the air and disappeared. Here it lay flat and heavy, reflecting even the smallest amount of light, pointing to me. I thought it odd that I saw no one else's breath hanging on the air. I wore my heaviest cloak, but still I shivered. Overhead, the ancient oaks and ash strangled all but the most determined strands of moonlight. Despite Morel's warning, I had a candle in my pocket. If necessary, I would use it. After all, it was a universal truth that even the smallest prick of light could overwhelm darkness. And then I would take my chances. I cursed myself for letting desperation rule my head. I reached a glen. This had to be it. Just as Morel had described, before me stood a giant ash tree, its trunk covered in a distinctive pattern of mushrooms that looked like handles beckoning me to climb the tree. "Don't touch them," Morel had warned. "They're poisonous to the touch, like poison ivy or stinging nettle. But 1,000 times worse. They are your sign. The rose will be in the small clearing just past the tree." Too afraid to step into the open, I pushed some foliage aside and crouched behind a clump of bushes as I peered into the clearing, looking for my floral quarry. My pulse panicked in my ears. The rose was nowhere in sight. I cursed my foolishness. I never should have trusted Morel. Or been out on what was ostensibly my mission, but was more than likely hers and hers alone. Never trust a witch was the second rule my mother had taught me. The moon disappeared behind a cloud. The last of the light flickered out. I was thrown into utter, complete darkness. My heart raced. My skin crawled. I was overwhelmed with a sense of being closed in and suffocated. If Morel was wrong that the night would be clear, and that cloud persisted. Just as I reached for the candle in my pocket, a beam of blue light cut through the canopy overhead. The moonbeam was so bright and clear that it lit the surrounding trees and underbrush, until I could see the bright reds and oranges of the most spectacular of fall foliage. But the rose? Where is the rose? I looked around frantically. No rose bush. No rose. Anger. Betrayal. Abject fear. So many emotions that had no names. Had I made a mistake, or had Morel intentionally sent me to my death? A wisp of fog appeared from deep in the woods across the glen from me. It curled its way into the glen, growing denser and thicker as it moved and filled the clearing. The forest is fighting back against the light. I shuddered, not daring to wager on which would win. But I had a sinking feeling. But the moonlight persisted, lighting the fog blue, caressing it until it glowed. And then, out of the moist compost on the forest floor, a small cane of a rosebush pushed up. Just one cane. It sprouted one leaf, then two as it grew at an enchanted, accelerated rate before my eyes. A bud grew out of one end, producing one long-stemmed deep red rose. As the fog grew denser, the bud began opening. Magically, the light of the blue moon cut the fog completely in two, parting it so that the rose stood in a clear, dancing moonbeam. I gasped as the bud opened into one perfect, dazzling blood-red rose. I had never seen anything so beautiful and perfect. The light sparkled on the petals as if lighting up dew. But the dew had long since settled. Nothing but magic explained the sparkles. I stared, mesmerized. How could I cut something that beautiful off from its lifeblood? I swore that the rose turned in my direction and bowed ever so slightly on its stem as if giving me a nod of its head. I can't kill something so beautiful and alive. My hands shook. I hesitated and swallowed hard. In that instant, the moon began to dip in the sky. The fog sensed its weakness, gained strength, and began breaching the moonbeam's defenses. I had no time to think. I gripped my dagger tightly, stepped into the clearing, and lunged for the rose.